The storm had rolled in faster than anyone in the valley expected. Wind slashed across the desert plain, bending brittle grasses and flinging dust through the ravines like thrown daggers. Thunder cracked above the canyons with a force that seemed to split the very sky. And through it all, Luke Holleran drove his rusted pickup, like a man with nowhere left to go. He wasn't looking for anything. He hadn't been looking for anything in years. After his wife passed, and after the last of the ranch hands left, he sold off what was left of the livestock and let the fences rot. The once proud acres of Rolling H Ranch were now just dry land and ghosts. The only thing Luke tended these days was silence, and even that had become heavy. So when the sky blackened and the wind screamed down from the north, he didn't turn back. He drove deeper into the hills, as if trying to outrun something that had already caught up to him. That's when he saw it. Through the slash of rain and dust, a shape staggered along the ridgeline, small, unsure, and alone. Luke squinted, his instincts flaring. He pulled the truck to the side, braced the door against the wind, and stepped out into the chaos. The rain was bitter cold. He walked toward the shape, boots sliding in the mud, heart pounding in his chest for the first time in months. It was a foal, a Mustang, no more than a few days old, soaked and shivering, its tiny legs wobbling as it tried to make sense of the terrain beneath it. Mud clung to its pale gray coat, and a nasty gash ran down its left flank, fresh, raw, and too deep for comfort. Luke looked around but saw no herd, no sign of its mother. Just sky and storm and the dying light of day. "Damn it," he muttered, already pulling off his jacket. The foal flinched as he approached, its eyes wide with fear, nostrils flaring. It made a pitiful sound, half whinny, half cry. Luke slowed, dropped to a knee. "Easy," he said gently. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The foal backed up a few steps before its legs buckled, and it collapsed into the mud, with a wet thud. Luke didn't wait. He slipped his arms under its trembling body and lifted. It was lighter than expected, fragile, barely hanging on. He cradled the creature against his chest and carried it back to the truck, mumbling curses under his breath, not at the foal, but at himself, for caring, for stopping, for letting anything break through the numbness he had built like armor. Back at the cabin, Luke worked quickly. He wrapped the foal in blankets by the old wood stove, cleaned a wound as best he could, and warmed a bottle of goat milk he had for the occasional feral cat that passed through. It took hours before the foal stopped shaking. Its eyes closed eventually, still wary but exhausted. Luke sat beside it, a forgotten cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. By dawn, the storm had passed, but something had shifted that went beyond the weather. He called the foal Dusty, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because of the way the colt's coat looked, ghost pale and smeared with earth. Maybe because it reminded him of something forgotten, something kicked up from old memories. Whatever the reason, it stuck. The next few days were spent in careful silence. Dusty wasn't quick to trust. Every time Luke came close, the foal's eyes would widen with fear, the same wide, wild look of something that had already learned the world was cruel. But Luke didn't push. He just showed up, regularly, feeding, cleaning the wound, talking softly, letting Dusty learn his rhythm. Luke had no business taking care of a wild foal. He knew it. He wasn't a vet, wasn't even a rancher anymore. But there was something about the way the colt looked at him, confused, cautious, but still holding on, that hooked something deep in his chest. He hadn't felt needed in a long time. Not really. By the end of the week, Dusty was strong enough to stand for longer stretches. His limp was still there, but healing. Luke had begun to walk him out into the corral during the early mornings, letting him feel the sun again. Those walks were quiet affairs, measured and slow, with Dusty always a few steps behind, ears flicking, eyes alert. Luke found himself talking more, not just to the foal, but to the wind, to the ranch, to memories. He told Dusty about the first horse he ever broke, a red mare with a mean streak and a heart of gold. He spoke of how his wife used to sing in the kitchen while making cinnamon rolls, and how the smell of baked sugar still haunted the wood. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the light turned golden, he'd just sit on the porch while Dusty chewed at some hay nearby, and the silence didn't feel so heavy anymore. Then, one morning, everything changed. It started with a sound, a distant rhythm, soft at first, like far-off drums. Luke stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and froze. On the ridge, where the mountains met the sky, stood a line of horses, Mustangs, at least a dozen, staring down at the ranch like painted ghosts. Dusty noticed them, too. His ears perked. He neighed a high, sharp call that echoed across the land. The herd answered. Luke's heart pounded. He hadn't seen wild horses this close in years, not since before the drought and the fences, and the selling off of everything that mattered. The stallion at the front, a dark, muscled brute with a jagged blaze, stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. The others followed. Luke didn't move. He couldn't. The moment was too unreal. The horses descended the ridge in silence, hooves barely making a sound on the rocky earth. Dusty walked toward them, unsure, cautious. He stopped just at the edge of the corral. The stallion halted, then stepped closer. And then something happened that Luke would never forget. The stallion bowed his head. Not in submission, not in weakness, but in recognition. And one by one, the rest of the herd followed suit. Dusty took a step forward, then another. Luke's breath caught in his throat. Dusty was leaving, going back to where he came from. And yet, the colt turned his head, looked back at Luke. Just for a second. But in that second, everything in Luke's chest cracked open. The foal was no longer lost. But Luke had just begun to be found. Luke didn't sleep that night. Even after the Mustang herd disappeared over the ridge with Dusty at their side, the image remained. Those solemn, intelligent eyes, the silent nod from the stallion, and that final glance from the foal. He kept replaying it like a worn film reel in his mind, over and over, unsure of what it meant, but unable to let it go. By morning, the cabin felt emptier than ever. Dusty's blankets lay untouched beside the stove, the small feed bucket still half full. Luke sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a chipped mug, the coffee long cold. 1,000 thoughts spun in his mind, but one kept rising to the surface. Why had they come? Mustangs didn't just appear like that. Not near people. Not in herds. And they sure didn't bow. He stepped out onto the porch. The air was still, the sky overcast but dry. A few birds called in the distance. Nothing else moved. He scanned the ridge, hoping, foolishly, perhaps, to see a shape, a flicker of movement. But the land was empty. Still, a new urgency pulsed beneath his skin. Dusty had gone with them, yes, but not with hesitation. There had been something exchanged in that moment, something unspoken. Luke felt it in his bones. He couldn't explain it, but it left behind a hum in his chest, like something wasn't finished yet. Later that day, he saddled his old gelding, a quiet bay named Duke, and rode toward the canyon. The gelding's hooves echoed softly on the dry earth, the sound comforting in its rhythm. Luke hadn't ridden in months, maybe longer. His body ached with each movement, but something kept pushing him forward. He followed the tracks where the herd had gone. Faint impressions in the dirt, a broken branch here, a clump of hair snagged on a fence post there. He rode in silence, eyes sharp, breath shallow. The land was wide and open, stretching toward the Sierra foothills, like a forgotten promise. Around midday, he found them. The herd stood in a shallow valley tucked between two hills. A stream trickled nearby, and the horses grazed peacefully. Dusty was among them, still smaller, still limping slightly, but stronger now. He moved with more certainty, confidence. Luke didn't ride closer. He stayed just at the ridge, hidden behind a juniper bush, watching. The stallion noticed him first. Those eyes again, unblinking, sharp aware. But the horse didn't bolt, didn't challenge, just stared, as if waiting for Luke to make a decision. Luke exhaled, slow and steady, then turned Duke around and rode home. That night, he dreamt of fire, flames licking across dry grass, smoke curling like fingers into the sky. Horses screamed in the distance. Dusty, running, trapped. Luke awoke with a start, heart pounding, shirt clinging to his back. The dream had felt real, too real. He got up before dawn and went outside. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying a strange, acrid scent. He sniffed the air, frowning. Something was burning. By noon, smoke was visible on the horizon. It started near the old rail tracks, where lightning had struck dry sage the night before. Now the fire rolled across the valley like a slow, creeping monster, consuming everything in its path. Luke watched from his porch, binoculars trembling in his hands. The Mustangs were in its path. He didn't hesitate. Within 10 minutes, he had Duke saddled again, a pair of bolt cutters tied to the saddle horn, and 2 full canteens strapped to his back. He packed nothing else. There was no time. He rode hard, faster than he had in years, the wind slicing across his face, the sound of hooves pounding like war drums in his ears. By the time he reached the edge of the valley, the smoke was thick, the sky painted orange and gray. The air burned his lungs. Still, he pressed forward. The herd was panicked now, circling, restless. Dusty stood at the center, pinned between 2 maras. The stallion charged toward the smoke, then pulled back, uncertain. A fence line hemmed them in from the west, a rusted relic that someone had built long ago. Useless most of the year, but now it was a trap. Luke understood instantly. The herd couldn't break through. They were boxed in. He spurred Duke forward, eyes stinging, throat raw. When he reached the fence, he didn't stop to think. He dismounted, yanked the bolt cutters from the saddle, and set to work. Each snip felt like a gunshot in the heavy silence. Wire snapped back and whipped through the air. Sweat poured down his temples. The heat pressed in like a living thing. Then the last wire gave. The stallion was the first to notice. He turned his head sharply, ears flicking. Then he moved. Fast. A blur of muscle and instinct. The others followed. Hooves thundered past Luke like a stampede of ghosts. The ground shook. Dust rose around him, mingling with smoke. He staggered back as the herd poured through the gap, wild and free. Dusty hesitated. He stood at the edge of the broken fence, trembling. His eyes locked on Luke's, uncertain, afraid. Luke took a step forward. "Go," he said, voice hoarse. The colt didn't move. "Go." Still nothing. The fire crackled nearby, a wall of flame rising behind them. Luke coughed violently. Then, as if something clicked, Dusty bolted. He ran full stride, toward the others, legs kicking, head high. Luke dropped to his knees, coughing, eyes streaming. Then something happened he never expected. The stallion circled back. He stopped just a few feet away from Luke, steam rising off his body, muscles twitching. He lowered his head, not quite bowing, but close. Close enough. And then he turned and vanished into the smoke. Luke sat there for a long moment, unable to move. The wind shifted again, and the fire veered to the east, away from the gap in the fence. Away from him. He stood slowly, wiped the soot from his face, and turned back toward Duke. The gelding stood waiting, calm as ever. As Luke mounted, his knees trembling beneath him, he realized something strange. The emptiness that had haunted the ranch, the silence that had settled like dust in his soul. Something had shifted. Something was beginning to heal. The days after the fire were marked by silence. Not the oppressive kind that weighs heavy, but a quieter, reflective calm, like the land itself was taking a breath. Luke moved through it like a man who had seen a ghost, and come out the other side changed. The ranch, long ignored, now felt like something living again. The morning light seemed softer, the wind more patient. He repaired the fence he'd cut, methodical work that steadied his hands and quieted his mind. Smoke still lingered in the distant hills, but the immediate danger had passed. No word came from the forestry service or the handful of neighbors who lived miles away. Out here, survival was a private affair. Luke didn't expect to see them again. The herd had escaped, Dusty was safe, and whatever strange understanding had passed between him and that stallion, it had run its course. He told himself that, repeated it, tried to believe it, but on the 4th morning, he found hoof prints. Just beyond the ridge where the grass still grew tall and gold, fresh indentations, light, distinct, and deliberate, formed a path that curved along the outer edge of his property. They weren't scattered like a wild chase, nor were they deep like a stampede. These were different, measured, intentional, as if someone had walked the border. He followed them, cautious but curious. They led through the juniper trees and down into a shallow gully, then vanished as the ground turned rocky. Luke scanned the horizon. Nothing. just distant hills and the shimmer of heat rising off the earth. But that night, he heard them. A soft snort, the creak of movement, hooves brushing stone. He stepped out onto the porch with the lantern held high, eyes scanning the shadows. His breath caught. They were there, at least 5 of them. Not close, not threatening, just watching. Dusty stood near the front, his coat already darker, his body filling out. The foal was becoming something else now. Luke didn't move. Neither did they. Minutes passed. Then the stallion, unmistakable in his commanding presence, stepped forward. He didn't come close, but he didn't need to. He looked straight at Luke, then turned, and the herd melted back into the night. It became a pattern. Every few nights, they returned. Sometimes they stood at a distance. Sometimes they circled the property like sentries. Dusty came closer each time. Luke never fed them, never called out. He simply acknowledged them, a nod here, a soft word there. And then one morning, Dusty was alone. He stood just outside the corral, head low, tail swishing lazily. Luke approached with slow, careful steps. The colt didn't bolt. His eyes met Luke's and held steady. "Back already?" Luke asked softly, voice barely above a whisper. Dusty stepped forward. Luke opened the gate. It was strange how easily the old rhythm returned. Dusty remembered the layout, the barn, the stall, the water trough. He moved with a mix of caution and confidence, ears flicking but never pinning. Luke let him settle, kept his distance at first. But over the next few days, the bond rebuilt itself quietly, like a song picking up where it had left off. The herd didn't return. Not right away. Weeks passed. The weather warmed. Luke cleaned out the barn fully for the first time in years. He repaired the tack room door, replaced the broken hinges on the feed bins. Dusty watched him work, sometimes standing near, other times lying under the shade of the large cottonwood tree near the fence. And then one evening, as Luke was brushing the dust off his old saddle, he heard hooves again. But this time, they came from the east. He stepped out, blinking into the dusk. A single horse stood just beyond the fence line, a mare. Young, but not a filly. Her flank bore a long, pale scar. She was thin, eyes wary. Dusty stood at the fence watching her, ears forward, body tense. Luke didn't move. The mare stayed only a moment, then turned and vanished. The next night, she returned, this time with another, a younger colt with a limp. And the night after that, 3 more came. Thin, wounded, frightened. Runaways, Luke realized. Outcasts. Maybe survivors of another herd lost to fire or drought. Dusty paced the fence restlessly now, back and forth. Something in him had shifted again, urgency replacing calm. Luke opened the gate. He wasn't sure what made him do it. Maybe instinct, maybe something deeper. But the moment he did, Dusty slipped out, not with the fear of a horse escaping, but with the purpose of one returning to something greater. He approached the small group, body language calm but authoritative. There were soft whinnies, cautious steps, heads bobbing. Luke watched as the colt nudged the younger horse's shoulder, then circled around the mare as if reassuring her. Dusty had changed. He wasn't just recovering anymore. He was becoming a leader. The group lingered through the night, then disappeared by dawn. But the next evening, Dusty returned, alone again, and walked straight into the corral like he always had. Luke leaned against the gate, watching him. "Bringing strays now, huh?" he murmured. Dusty blinked slowly. That night, Luke pulled out an old leather-bound notebook. He hadn't written in it in years. The pages were yellowing, the spine cracked, but the pen still glided smoothly. He began documenting what he saw, the appearances, the behavior, the injuries. Notes on Dusty's interactions, patterns in the visits. He wasn't sure why at first, but something told him this was more than random. Over the next few weeks, more horses came. Never all at once, never during the day, but always near Dusty, always with hesitation. Luke opened the gate every time, and Dusty would step out, guide them gently, then return. It wasn't just a bond anymore. It was something bigger. Dusty was forming something out there, building trust, maybe even a new herd. Not just surviving, but leading. Luke stood by the corral one evening, arms folded, watching the fading light spill gold across the hills. Dusty stood beside him, calm and still. "I don't know what you're doing out there," Luke said, voice low. But it matters, doesn't it? The colt turned his head slightly, and for a moment, Luke didn't feel alone. The morning mist curled like smoke over the hills, wrapping the ranch in a hush that seemed to hold its breath. Luke stood by the corral, fingers curled over the top rail, staring into the distance where the land folded into low ridges. He hadn't slept much. Something in the air felt different, thick with tension, or maybe anticipation. Dusty wasn't in the corral. He hadn't returned last night. It wasn't the first time, but it was the longest he'd been gone. Luke didn't call for him. He didn't saddle up or ride out in search. There was a rhythm to these visits, and Dusty had always returned. But now, with each passing hour, unease threaded deeper into his chest. By midday, the silence fractured. First came the sound, distant hooves, faded first, then multiplying. Luke stepped off the porch, shielding his eyes. Dust rose on the horizon, a low cloud of movement. They were coming. Not just a few strays or a nervous pair. A herd. The entire hillside shifted like a living wave of color and motion. At the front, unmistakable even from afar, was Dusty. But Luke's relief twisted into concern. Behind the colt ran dozens, Mustangs in every shade of brown, gray, and black, coats gleaming with sweat, eyes wild with purpose. He'd never seen them like this, moving as one. Dusty wasn't just returning. He was leading, and they were headed straight for the ranch. Luke stepped back instinctively, unsure what was happening. His heart pounded. Then he saw it. At the rear of the group, barely keeping pace, a stallion limping, blood at his shoulder, head swaying with each stride. He was old, weak, struggling. The herd thundered past the far fence line, circling around the ranch. Not once, twice. Dusty kept his place at the head, and with a sudden cry, a high, commanding whinny, he stopped. The others followed suit, slowing in waves until they formed a wide ring around the ranch house. Not penned, not trapped, surrounded. Luke stood frozen. They didn't charge, didn't scatter. They waited. Dusty stepped forward. Luke's boots crunched softly on gravel as he approached, heart thudding so loud he could hear it in his ears. He crossed the yard, slowly, deliberately, until he stood a few feet from the colt. Dusty's body was different now, taller, broader, a muscular frame beneath his dun coat. The gangly foal was gone. He was a leader now, clear and unquestioned. Their eyes met. For a long moment, nothing moved. The herd held their ground. Dusty breathed deep, steady, watching Luke with something that wasn't fear. It was understanding. Then he turned, and behind him, the herd parted. Through the opening, the wounded stallion stepped forward, barely standing, legs trembling, eyes cloudy with age. He walked past Dusty, past the others, until he stood in front of Luke, sides heaving with effort. The old stallion lowered his head, just slightly. A gesture, not submission, but trust. Luke blinked hard. The meaning settled on him like the weight of a long-forgotten truth. They weren't here for food or shelter. They were here because they had chosen him. The stallion collapsed then, knees giving way, body sinking into the soft earth. Dusty stepped forward, lowering his head to nudge the older horse's shoulder, but the old one didn't rise. Luke dropped to his knees beside him, hands hovering, unsure. He reached out slowly, resting a hand against the stallion's neck. The breath was still there, faint, ragged. Not fear. Peace. A final breath left him. Dusty stood over them both, unmoving. Luke closed the stallion's eyes with his fingertips, heart heavy but full. The herd did not panic. They did not flee. They watched, silent sentinels in the rising dusk. By nightfall, the body had been buried beneath the old cottonwood near the barn. Luke worked quietly, reverently, muscles aching, but mind clear. Dusty stood nearby, flanked by a few younger horses, his posture tall and unshaken. After the grave was filled and marked, Luke leaned on his shovel, staring at the small mound. "He came to die here," he said softly. "And you brought him." Dusty's ear flicked. "They trust you. And you," Luke paused. "You trusted me." The moon rose silver and full, bathing the land in soft light. One by one, the herd began to move, peeling away from the circle, walking, not running, back toward the hills. Dusty stayed behind. Luke stood in silence. Then Dusty stepped forward, closer than ever before. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead gently against Luke's chest. The touch was brief, and when he lifted it again, he turned, trotted after the others, and disappeared into the rising mist. Luke didn't follow. He watched them vanish, one shadow at a time, until the ranch was quiet again. But something had changed. They would be back. Not every night. Maybe not even for weeks. But they would return, not as wild beasts passing through, but as kin. Dusty had chosen his herd, and in a quiet, powerful way, Luke had become a part of it. The ranch no longer felt empty. Later, as Luke sat by the window with his notebook open, he wrote the date carefully at the top of the page. Below it, just one sentence. The wild came to me, not to be tamed, but to be understood. He closed the book and looked out into the dark, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone.